Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're cracking open a preliminary assessment on the economic consequences of a second Trump administration.
And this is a really exhaustive volume. We're talking about leading global economists, Nobel laureates.
Exactly. And the analysis is, well, it's sharp. It gets right into crippling tariffs, hitting your wallet, deep cuts that could threaten U.S. scientific leadership.
And a global economy that, according to this report, is facing serious fragmentation.
So our mission today is to really distill the key findings to understand how policies put in place in 2025 are already reshaping the U.S. and global economic stability.
Right. And what these economists are describing isn't some sudden collapse. They call it a gradual unraveling of the rules that have, kept things stable for decades.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Where do we begin?
I think we have to start with trade. That's the most visible and weaponized tool that they identify.
Let's start there then, and let's put a price tag on it, because the report is very clear about what this new era of trade hostility means for the average person's wallet.
It is. The first big point they make is that this has moved beyond just China.
Right. It's not a single trade war anymore.
No. The analysis says the hostility is now aimed at the entire world, and that the U.S. is sort of actively walking away from its traditional role as a leader in global trade.
And they pinpoint a specific moment for this shift, don't they?
They do. The Liberation Day tariff announcement, April 2nd, 2025. And look, the name itself tells you everything you need to know.
Liberation Day. It sounds like a break from something.
Exactly. A break from what they see as constraints. Things like, multilateral agreements, WTO rules. The mindset is that these are shackles holding the economy back.
And breaking them.
It pushes the whole global system towards something that's less coordinated and, much more prone to conflict.
So what's the immediate result of that for people here in the U.S.?
A massive and immediate tax burden. The report is blunt about this. It calls these tariffs the largest tax increase in a generation for U.S. taxpayers.
The largest in a generation. Can we quantify that?
Oh, yes. The numbers are very specific. In the short run, the cost to the median household is estimated at around $2,300.
$2,300.
That's the initial hit. Now, it does settle a bit to about $1,900 once you factor in, consumers switching to cheaper alternatives.
But $1,900 is still a huge amount of money.
It's a huge amount. And here's where the analysis gets really interesting. They compare that $1,900 figure to the tax burden of lower-income families. For them, it's comparable to their entire annual federal income tax bill.
Wow. So in effect, it's like doubling their taxes.
It acts like a highly regressive consumption tax. The burden falls disproportionately on those who can least afford it.
So if the cost is so clear, $1,900 for a typical family, why isn't the political backlash louder?
Well, it's a couple things. Those substitution effects you mentioned, they do mask some of the pain. You stop buying the expensive imported cheese and switch to a domestic one. You feel it, but it's not a line item on a bill.
And the other reason?
The tariffs are also succeeding at something else, raising government revenue. They've become a pretty significant source of cash for the Treasury.
Which means they're probably not going away anytime soon.
It makes them fiscally sticky. They become a permanent policy tool, even though the data is very clear that they're hurting the middle class through higher prices.
Which we can see in the CPI data.
Right. And here's the paradox. The report says they're also linked to a falling rate of blue-collar job creation.
How does that work? I thought the whole point was to protect those jobs.
Because manufacturing isn't simple. You need inputs. And when the cost of all your imported steel, aluminum, and components goes up, it becomes more expensive to build things here. So it hurts the very sector it claims to help.
Okay, so that's the domestic picture. But these effects must be rippling out globally. What happens when the world's biggest consumer market just starts putting up walls?
You get contraction. The economic modeling they cite is pretty stark. Under what they call Scenario 1, the most conservative one, you're looking at a world GDP loss of up to -0.62%.
That sounds small, but for the entire planet.
It's enormous. We're talking trillions of dollars in lost output. And world trade itself contracts by as much as -3.42%. The whole system just shrinks.
And for the U.S. itself.
The projected GDP fall is actually worse, between -0.9% and -1.2%, with consumer prices jumping by up to 3.3%. So the economy is shrinking while everything is getting more expensive.
Stagflation, basically.
It has all the hallmarks, yes.
Now, the report singles out China's response to all this? It wasn't just, rhetoric or tit-for-tat tariffs on soybeans.
No, not at all. It was incredibly strategic. They countered with leverage, not just a broadside. They launched something called Announcement Number 18.
And what was that?
It was an export control regime, but it was targeted at one very specific, very critical thing: rare earth magnets.
Rare earth magnets. Those are in everything.
Everything high-tech, world-class electric motors, missile guidance systems, wind turbines, you name it. And the key is China produces something like 90% of the global supply.
So by controlling the magnets, they control the entire supply chain downstream.
That's the move. They force the U.S. and its allies into a choice. Do you want to build your next-gen fighter jets and EVs, or do you want to continue this trade war? It's coercive leverage without firing a single tariff back at U.S. farmers.
Is that sustainable for them, though? Aren't they hurting their own exporters by limiting sales?
It's a calculated risk, a short-term revenue loss for immense long-term geopolitical gain. They're trading a few dollars today for a chokehold on the technology of tomorrow.
And what about our allies? The report mentions Canada and Mexico getting hit particularly hard.
Our closest partners, yes. Under USMCA, they were used to basically zero tariffs.
And now?
The average U.S. tariff they faced jumped from 0.1% to over 12%, a massive shock.
But Canada supplies something like 60% of U.S. oil and gas imports. Surely that gives them some leverage to push back.
You'd think so. And they tried. They retaliated on a limited scale, but it didn't work. Ultimately, they were forced to capitulate.
They just gave in.
They had to come back to the table, drop their own digital services tax, and remove most of their counter tariffs. It exposed how fragile their position is when faced with the sheer economic weight of the U.S. market. Access to that market is more important than anything else.
So that's the external picture, a fragmented, conflict-prone world. But the assessment says that's mirrored by a growing instability inside the U.S.
Yes, and this is maybe the part of the report that's most concerning for the long term. They talk about institutional erosion.
What do they mean by that?
A declining confidence in the impartial rule of law. They argue that this is a deep structural fragility that's being masked by, short-term resilience in the stock market or GDP figures.
And this erosion comes from a pattern of what they call strong executive supremacy.
Right. It's the administration attempting to change not just policies, but how the law itself operates. Yeah. For any business, any investor, that creates a huge amount of uncertainty.
And uncertainty costs money.
It always does. It raises risk premiums on everything. You have to pay more to borrow, to invest, because you can't be sure the rules won't just be changed tomorrow by decree.
Can you give us some specific examples of this that the report cites?
Sure. There are a few really striking ones. First, the report notes multiple instances of the administration simply refusing to comply with valid court orders.
Which is a pretty fundamental break.
It's a direct challenge to the separation of powers. Then there was the suspension of enforcement for laws like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the FCPA.
The anti-bribery law for U.S. companies overseas.
That's the one. Suspending it for 6 months basically sends a signal to the world that the U.S. is temporarily relaxing its commitment to anti-corruption. That really damages the U.S. reputation for stability and transparency, which has been a huge source of its economic power.
And they also mentioned sweeping deregulation.
Yes, deregulation that happens based purely on executive views, bypassing the normal administrative procedures, no public comment, no lengthy review. That weakens the ability to create durable, well-thought-out rules.
And this push for executive control extends to the independent agencies, too. The Fed, the FTC.
Exactly. And these agencies were designed specifically to be shielded from politics, to provide stability through different administrations.
And things like banking, monetary policy.
All of it. But the report details efforts to terminate officials who have statutory job protections, to assert direct control over regulatory proposals. This creates what they call policy oscillation.
The rules just swing back and forth with the political winds.
And that oscillation, that uncertainty, it just dampens economic activity. Firms just stop investing because they can't plan for the future with any confidence.
You mentioned the Fed. This kind of volatility must pose a long-term risk to the U.S. dollar's status as the world's reserve currency.
It's a huge risk. This gets to the idea of the dollar's exorbitant privilege.
Which is the benefit the U.S. gets from everyone else using our currency.
Right. We can borrow cheaply. We don't face the same currency risks. But that privilege is built on trust. And the report notes a really worrying sign that this trust is eroding.
What the?
In the chaos right after that Liberation Day tariff announcement, market observers saw the dollar do something very strange.
Okay.
It temporarily stopped acting like a safe haven currency.
So usually in a crisis, everyone flees to the dollar.
Exactly. But for a moment there, it became a risk-on currency. The volatility was so high that investors were looking for alternatives.
So if the dollar isn't the safe place to run during a crisis, what does that mean for its long-term dominance?
It implies a potential structural shift. Look, historically, when the U.S. economy had problems, the dollar still got stronger because the institutions, the rule of law, the independent Fed, were seen as solid.
The bedrock was still there.
Yes. But when the policy itself is the source of the instability, markets start to realize that the bedrock is cracking. And that's when you see central banks around the world start to think, maybe, just maybe, we should diversify our reserves away from the dollar. It's a slow process, but that's how it begins.
And at the same time, you have fiscal policy adding even more pressure. The report mentions a huge tax cut and spending bill.
Yes, the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill, or OBBA. The forecasts for that are, well, they're not pretty. It's expected to boost deficits to an average of 6.1% of GDP all the way through 2035.
Deficits that large, especially when unemployment is low, that usually means one thing.
Higher inflation. And that puts the Federal Reserve in an almost impossible position.
Because their job is to keep prices stable.
Exactly. They have that dual mandate, stable prices and maximum employment. But if these huge deficits start to undermine investor confidence in U.S. Treasury bonds, if people stop wanting to buy U.S. debt,
Then the Fed has a terrible choice to make.
a classic policy dilemma. Do they step in and buy the bonds themselves to support the market, which would inject cash and risk even more inflation? Or do they raise interest rates to fight inflation, which could crash the economy and make the debt problem even worse? Fiscal policy has basically boxed them in.
Okay, so we've talked about trade wars and weakening institutions. But the report also dives into the deep, long-term costs to America's basic engine for growth, starting with people.
Human capital, yes. The section on immigration is pretty stark. The analysis says that the intensified enforcement and just the hostile environment towards immigrants carries a very specific, measurable economic price.
What kind of numbers are we talking about?
They estimate that current policies will reduce the net number of college-educated immigrants by about 200,000 per year.
And non-college educated.
By 400,000 per year. So a total drop in net working age immigration of 600,000 people every year.
And the economic impact of that loss.
The calculation is a reduction in U.S. GDP of almost 0.7%. That's about $205 billion a year.
So we're essentially trading, well, whatever the perceived benefit of the policy is, for a guaranteed $205 billion drag on the economy every single year.
That's the trade-off presented in the analysis, and it also reduces total employment by about 510,000 workers.
And there's an interesting ripple effect in there, something about the impact on the domestic labor force, specifically on women.
Yes, this is a really fascinating point. It creates a very specific burden on high-skilled, native-born women. Well, the research shows that the loss of less educated immigrants in what they call the household production sector.
Things like housekeeping, childcare, elder care.
Exactly. The loss of that labor pool increases the time burden on high-skilled women. The data shows that access to low-skilled immigrant labor historically allowed professional women to increase their working time by about 0.6 hours per week.
Which adds up.
It really does. So by restricting that labor pool, you're essentially reversing those productivity gains. It's a hidden economic drag that reduces the output of some of our most productive native workers.
And at the same time this is happening with human capital, the administration is also proposing deep cuts to the very institutions that drive innovation.
This is what the report calls a direct erosion of America's comparative advantage.
Huh.
The proposed budget cuts for 2026 are, frankly, staggering.
Give me the highlights.
A 40% cut for the National Institutes of Health, the NIH. A 56% cut for the National Science Foundation. 24% for NASA.
These are the engines of basic research and development.
The absolute core of it. And when you defund these institutions, what are you really giving up?
I mean, what kind of return are we trading away for short-term budget savings?
We're trading away exponential growth for what are, in the grand scheme of the federal budget, minimal savings. Economic studies consistently show that federal R&D spending has an incredible return on investment.
What's the number?
The estimated return is around 150%. So for every dollar you cut, you're losing $1.50 in future growth. You don't feel it today, or maybe even next year. But what you lose is the ability to invent whole new industries. You cede that technological leadership to other countries.
And these cuts, they go beyond just the big science agencies. They extend across what the report calls state capacity.
Right. The government's ability to just do its basic non-military job. You've probably heard about the effort to downsize the federal workforce, which they call DOGE.
Yes.
Now, the federal workforce itself is pretty small, less than 2% of total employment, so the immediate macroeconomic drag from layoffs isn't huge. The long-run risk, though, is profound.
Because you're losing the ability to provide essential public goods.
Public goods that the private sector relies on. We're talking about stable market rules from the SEC. High-quality economic data, which 95% of businesses say is critical for their planning.
Or things like weather forecasting.
That's a perfect example. The report highlights cuts to NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
So what does that mean in practical terms?
It means lower quality data for insuring crops, less accurate storm warnings for coastal areas. It undermines our ability to mitigate future shocks.
And finally, this retreat from public goods extends internationally with the gutting of foreign aid.
Yes, the report talks about the termination of long-standing programs like USAID, and they're clear, this is more than just a budget cut. It's an abandonment of global public health infrastructure.
It creates a vacuum.
A huge vacuum that no other country can just step in and fill. Now, global health accounts saw smaller initial cuts, but the proposed cuts for FY 2026 could lead to considerably greater mortality.
They actually calculated that.
They did. For instance, the analysis estimates that ending all U.S. health aid to a given country could increase its death rate by as much as 39%.
39%.
And beyond the immediate humanitarian cost, it dismantles the very systems that protect us all from future pandemics. That's a lesson we should have learned very acutely from COVID-19. These risks don't respect borders, and defunding global monitoring makes everyone less safe.
So when you pull all of this together, the trade wars, the institutional decay, the long-term drag on innovation and public health, what's the final picture that emerges?
The evidence across all these areas, it doesn't point to some abrupt, stock market crash or sudden collapse.
It's more subtle than that.
Much more. It points to a gradual, structural unraveling, an unraveling of the rules and the institutions that have, for the most part, anchored global stability for decades. The real challenge is, what does the world do when the main architect of that system starts to actively undermine it?
Which brings us to the final provocative thought for our listener.
Right. And the critical question you have to ask yourself is this. Is what we're seeing cyclical? Is it just a momentary policy detour that can be reversed by the next administration? Or has something deeper changed? Has this erosion become a structural, permanent shift that's forcing the world to invent entirely new economic frameworks to work together?
That is the essential question, and I think we'll all be wrestling with it for the next decade. This has been the deep dive into the economic consequences outlined by the CEPR preliminary assessment.
A fascinating and very sobering read.
Indeed. You've been listening to Le Podcast de Philippe. If you found this deep dive valuable, please help us reach 2,000 subscribers and share our podcast with someone who needs this level of insight. Until next time, keep diving deep into the facts.